breaking the wall of common sense. This is Censor Studio. Recently, we've been mostly delivering news about wars and conflicts, but we think it's time to share some good news too. A mineral agreement has been signed between the US and Ukraine. Many burdensome clauses for Ukraine have been removed, resulting in a somewhat agreeable deal. Let's take a look at it today. On April 30th local time, the US and Ukrainian governments surprised the global diplomatic community. They suddenly signed a historic agreement related to the development of rare earth elements and other minerals in Ukraine. This so-called mineral agreement officially recognizes US participation in the rights to develop part of Ukraine's mineral resources. This is seen as more than just an economic agreement. It's a significant event signaling expanded US influence in Ukraine's post-war reconstruction. Here's what's interesting. Just 2 months ago, between February and March 2025, the possibility of this agreement being signed seemed very low. In early March, the US and Ukraine were in extreme conflict during negotiations. During an official White House meeting, Presidents Trump and Zelensky exchanged harsh words, causing negotiations to break down. After that, the United States began to put strong pressure on Ukraine, and the relationship between the two countries started to deteriorate. Then came a dramatic turning point at Pope Francis's funeral mass held on April 26 at the Vatican. Both President Trump and President Zelensky attended this solemn international event, and the Vatican arranged a meeting between them. The meeting was highly unusual in both form and setting, just 2 chairs placed across from each other for a 15-minute discussion. Foreign media reported the atmosphere as exceptionally serious and honest. The Pope's final words were called to end the war. Perhaps they struck a chord. It's said that the two leaders gained a deeper understanding of each other's positions during that meeting. After this short but meaningful meeting, officials from both countries swiftly resumed negotiations and rapidly narrowed their differences. Just 4 days later, on April 30th, they successfully signed the mineral agreement. The US Department of the Treasury announced in an official press release that the two countries had signed a pact to establish a US-Ukraine Reconstruction Investment Fund. Compared to the original draft, many believe Ukraine negotiated quite well. On February 14, 2025, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent met with President Zelensky in Kyiv and delivered a Trump administration proposal demanding 50% of all Ukrainian mineral resources. The agreement included 50% of mineral resources, including energy resources, new rare earth elements, and half of the profits from sales and mining. It was an enormous demand, granting the U.S. full ownership and decision-making rights over those minerals. According to a 2022 report by Canadian geopolitical analysis firm SecDev Group, Ukraine's mineral reserves are worth $12.4 trillion. That's approximately 1.79 quadrillion Korean won. So 50% would mean giving up roughly 800 trillion won worth of resources. There was also a clause stipulating that any mineral rights disputes would be settled in a New York district court, an arrangement many in Ukraine saw as humiliating. Moreover, the proposal lacked any mention of US security guarantees for Ukraine. Naturally, Ukraine immediately rejected that proposal, but the agreement that was eventually signed is quite different. Let's examine it carefully. At first glance, the core of this agreement looks like an economic partnership, but a closer look reveals a delicate balance struck after intense negotiations between the two sides. You can really tell how hard the working level officials labored on this. This agreement was structured to partly preserve Ukraine's sovereignty over its resources, while also granting the US priority access and revenue sharing rights. First, the agreement clearly states that all mineral resources in Ukraine remain state-owned. In other words, US or other foreign companies cannot claim ownership or exert direct control over Ukrainian mines or mineral reserves. However, in exchange, the US secured priority access rights to those resources. This means that when Ukraine develops strategic minerals like rare earths, nickel, cobalt, or lithium, American entities have the right to receive supplies before third countries. Essentially, this integrates Ukraine into the US-led global supply chain, blocking access for competitors like China or Russia. The profit-sharing structure from mineral development is also a key element. 50% of Ukraine's mining and export revenue is to be mandatorily contributed to a US-led Ukraine Reconstruction Fund. This fund will be used for post-war rebuilding efforts in Ukraine. Part of the profits will be reinvested into Ukraine, while the rest will go to the US side. Although this structure appears balanced, in reality it ensures the US leads reconstruction efforts and receives a significant share of profits and influence. The governance structure of the fund is also an interesting aspect. The board of the Reconstruction Fund is composed equally of members appointed by the US and Ukraine. This means that the voting rights within the board are equally divided between the US and Ukraine, giving the appearance of an equal structure. Of course, how this will work in practice remains to be seen, but personally, I think the US might wield greater influence through financial networks or corporations. But perhaps the biggest point is this: there is a clause stating that Ukraine does not have to repay the aid it has received from the US over the past 3 years. This includes both military and financial support, according to a study by the Kiel Institute, a think tank based in Germany. They estimated that from January 2022 to December 2024, the US provided approximately $119.7 billion in aid to Ukraine, about 175.2 trillion Korean won. Of course, the US Department of Defense reported a figure of $182.8 billion, about 267.4 trillion Korean won. This includes costs for military training in Europe and replenishing defense supplies. So the total amount of aid provided to Ukraine is estimated to be between 175 and 267 trillion won, a huge sum of money. And Ukraine no longer has to repay all of that. From Ukraine's perspective, that's a major win. Originally, the Trump administration demanded that Ukraine repay the hundreds of billions of dollars already provided, but that demand was removed from the final agreement. The US also withdrew its initial demand for control over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear facility in Europe. Though the US insisted on some control during negotiations, this was also dropped from the final version. Similarly, clauses that could have hindered Ukraine's future EU membership were all removed. And there's another notable point. The Trump administration used the term full-scale Russian invasion for the first time in this agreement. Until now, the US had avoided such wording to avoid provoking Russia. But by using full-scale invasion in this agreement, the US made its commitment to Ukraine's defense very clear. The agreement also includes a clause stating that the US will form a strategic partnership with Ukraine after the war and will dedicate itself to Ukraine's long-term reconstruction and economic modernization. This is more than just economic cooperation. It's practically a declaration that the US will be the key partner in Ukraine's political, military, and economic rebuilding. The idea is to grow Ukraine into a key hub in the Western supply chain that counters China and Russia after the war. Of course, just because the agreement has been signed doesn't mean the US can immediately start extracting minerals from Ukraine. Ukraine is still at war, and it will take considerable time to build the necessary infrastructure and facilities. Only once the war ends can substantial actions begin. Since the mineral agreement was signed, President Trump has also shown moves to accelerate aid to Ukraine. The US State Department sent a letter to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee approving the sale of military equipment and services worth over 72 billion won, about $50 million, to Ukraine. Exactly what kind of equipment and services are involved has not been disclosed. Earlier this year, President Trump temporarily halted military aid to Ukraine, but after signing the mineral agreement on March 31st, he announced that military support would resume. As a result, Ukraine's burden appears to have eased considerably. Meanwhile, Russia's response has been cold. Russia has strongly criticized the agreement. According to Reuters, Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, said on May 1st that this agreement is the result of President Trump squeezing Ukraine for military aid costs, and criticized Ukraine for having to sell off its national wealth to afford weapons. He clearly showed a great deal of discomfort, and understandably so, since the US seems ready to resume full military support for Ukraine, it's bound to make Russia uneasy. The US will likely continue to pressure Russia into a ceasefire. With this mineral agreement between the US and Ukraine, a ceasefire in the Ukraine war may have moved a step closer. I really hope the war ends soon and this situation is resolved. What do you think about the mineral agreement between the US and Ukraine? Please leave your thoughts in the comments. That's all for this video. Bye.